Coming, I try to speed my presentation so that I'm ready before you fall asleep after lunch. Because you don't fall asleep directly, but in half an hour it will be worse for whoever is the speaker after that period. I am not a requirement software engineer specialist. In essence, in deep of my heart, I am a tester. But when testers go into old age, they become interested in requirements, and this is what happened to me. And this is why I was happy to discover, by the way, you can find the presentation slides on this. It's probably the wrong place. Okay, is it better now? Not at all? I can keep it in hand. I can use your mic.
No?
Now, is it better now? I can use the big mic. Is it better now? Is it switched on?
It's switched on, yeah.
Can you hear me now? Oh, good. I promise not to scream. Okay, so if you are interested in the presentation, you can find it on my website for some days. Okay, so I was happy to see that there is so much about requirements on a testing conference, because after dealing with testing, as I've done for 20 years, you learn that it is essentially two sides of the same coin, requirements and the testing. So actually the best solution is somehow to try to manage it together. And this is what experts in both software testing and requirements engineering and software engineering in general have been saying, telling everybody, the IT industry, especially for many years, and IT industry has always refused to listen. Requirements, usually done by some very important people called business analysts. I have never met a requirements engineering in IT industry in my life. I always meet people who have business analysts on their business cards. And then something happens and poor testers come late at the end. So there is a famous V letter, which you know, and testers have been pleading, please, please, let us check if your requirements are testable, if they can be verified. We have, as testers, I say we as testers have been trying to bribe the people responsible for development. We promised if they let us see the requirements up front before we actually need to execute the tests, for example, that will be a great idea, a great way to actually verify and validate the requirements when they are analyzed, created, as gathered, defined, and so on. But it didn't help. So we cried in desperation. We just want the requirements. Okay, Lloyd here will teach you tomorrow how to test without requirements, which essentially means finding what the requirements are when you are testing. I hope you don't disagree. Not too much. So we wanted some requirements, and so we were told, no, you don't need requirements. We haven't got time with requirements. And of course, developers were very happy. I'm sorry for attacking developers again, but they were very happy. To work without requirements means you can produce interesting code instead of the code the boring customer wants. So what was happening? Why software? You can read books that were written and published 20, 30, 40 years ago. In the area of knowledge called software engineering, even before it was officially called software engineering, like early 60s or 50s, knew we need requirements up front in a way. So I'm not going to say anything against Agile. On the opposite, I'm very positive towards Agile, and that the requirements need to be testable. But the big business didn't listen. Who has time with the requirements? We want code. And of course, the trigger-happy developers didn't listen either. They love coding, and they didn't have time with some stupid high-level business requirements. The Boehm's curve, I'm not going to explain it. I hope you all know it. The curve telling us that bugs are easiest and cheapest to kill early. So instead of testing at the end, we should concentrate on finding bugs as early as possible. And of course, it didn't work either. Nobody would listen to wise software engineers. I have had, during many years on this planet, many arguments. We do not have time with requirements, and the best validation is in usage. And of course, we kind of people wanting to have requirements were treated very much like someone who is always thinking in a negative way. So what developers were doing, pretending they wanted to understand the stakeholders, the end users, the users. And what the business was doing, of course, I know I'm exaggerating, it was not really so bad, but there were many symptoms in that direction. It was bad. So we pretended, business pretended we had a full control, planning up front, but of course it didn't work. So we had this famous scope creep, this terrible creature coming and destroying all plans. And it even had a beautiful name, software crisis. People were talking about software crisis in the mid-60s, 50 years ago, and then mid-80s, 30 years ago. Probably some people talk about it now. And it all ended not well. The result was the picture you probably in one or another form know very well. And one day, a rider on a big white stallion came to our to help us, and it was called the Agile movement. You recognize this picture. It is the picture in slightly different color, which is on all web pages with agilemanifesto.org. And the Agile movement was essentially very unusual at the beginning, because people who were behind the start, and very often who are behind Agile movement today, express themselves in ways which are more appropriate to some religious movement than to IT process description, which essential Agile method is. And they use very funny language. This is the Babel Tower, where people stopped understanding each other. And they got other people extremely angry, because they were using their own special language. Instead of calling things like requirements, they used the phrase product backlog. Instead of talking about process improvement, they talked about sprint retrospective, and so on and so on. So it was very irritating, but at the same time, what a lot of speakers already today have been trying to translate from this language into more traditional software engineering language. And why is that the case? Because, I mean, besides Agile, there are hundreds or perhaps thousands of different software development paradigms in the world, and nobody is trying to make this sort of glossary so that the two schools can understand each other. What's so surprising with Agile? And I believe that what is surprising with Agile is that it simply works. I would never say that Agile is the best possible software development process in the world, but it is simply a process development system that has shown that it works somehow, mysteriously. I don't really understand, or I do believe I hope I have some ideas why. So, when Agile revolutionaries arrived, people suddenly, who stubbornly for many years refused to listen to software engineering experts, they started listening to software engineering experts when they were dressed like Agile revolutionaries. And even the big business bosses started listening. So actually, what Agile does is hidden behind some curious, funny even terminology. It is an extremely disciplined process that in many respects deploys into reluctant software industry good software engineering practices, just hidden somehow behind words, ways, style, so that people, instead of thinking it is boring, somehow miraculously follow it. So agile requirements engineering, I don't think there is any agile requirements engineering. Requirements engineering is requirements engineering, but using requirements engineering in agile projects has some specific features, characteristics. It is pragmatic and user-centered. That is, we ask users, we really, when defining and trying to find the requirements, we ask the users, and we ask them many times. And it focuses on direct communication. We had a wonderful presentation showing what can be results of cooking without direct communication, disastrous. So this is one good idea, not extremely novel. We've been software engineers knew for many years that talking with each other is a way of avoiding disasters. But who listened to us? No one before Agile came. It is iterative. You cannot know, nobody knows, not end users, from the beginning what the requirements should be. So you have to come back and ask them again after showing them a piece of code. Somebody said today, Agile is not sloppy. I believe in the contrary. Agile is an extremely disciplined process that somehow people do not stubbornly refuse to follow, but are happy to follow, and that makes me happy. What I very much like about Agile, especially Agile Scrum, but not necessarily only Scrum, is the tight coupling between, in Agile methodology, between requirements and testing, and requirements and project management. I would sometimes call Agile methods, I would be happy to call them requirement-centered testing and project management, but I'm not sure they would like such names. And somehow it is convincing, and this is beyond my ability to explain. I don't know why when Agile people say, we work this way and don't you dare refuse, because then what happens? Sprint termination, the most terrible thing. Because you try to change the requirements, then we terminate the sprint because we cannot work this way, and somehow they get their way. They would never listen to other people if you thought something like this. So in my opinion, Agile has fulfilled a number of very old requirement engineering dreams. Requirement engineers have many years been asking everybody, pleading, please, you cannot make a software project without requirements. It's absurd. And this is what Agile delivers. Somehow, even if you pay the price of calling requirements project, product or sprint backlog, we cannot have an Agile project without requirements, which was quite, alas, possible in projects ostensibly calling them self-disciplined, planned, and so on, where you pretended you had requirements, but in reality you had your vague visions about requirements. About elicitation, defining the requirements. An old dream was find them continuously, not just at the beginning, but ask many times, and we've got it. Agile methods make it obligatory to find the requirements many times, show them, and so on. One point of contact. The problem with requirements arriving from 100 different sources, every source having a different opinion, changing their mind, and so on. So we wished we had one point of contact, and now we have officially. He or she is called product owner. Then we were dreaming about prototyping, but we got the answer. There's no time for prototyping, just make the final product. Now suddenly we've got prototyping, even if it's called not prototyping and sprint demo or review. We were very interested, software engineers wanted to include, and not surprise, include developers in requirements process instead of surprising them with unrealistic, impossible, poorly defined requirements. And we've got it, sprint planning. In sprint planning, the three amigos should sit together, the product owner representing the stakeholders, and the testers and the developers. Common language. You must have a glossary to, very often, and quite rightly, requirements engineering is seen as a translation process from business language into supposedly quite different IT language, and the Agile approach has solved the problem. We just are allowed, mostly, of course I'm again exaggerating, to use business language. User stories are defined by the gurus who tell us how to write them, like Alistair Cockburn, for example, something that is by definition written in domain or business language. Another old dream, developers were somehow very often involved in discussions which requirements should be done when, which is more important, and so on and so on. We wanted to let them make the code and not take part in these endless discussions. And this is what has happened, because developers should, in principle, sit down during sprint planning meeting with the product owner. Sometimes they are very reluctant to come, in my experience, to sprint planning meetings. They tell something we have heard many times before, we don't have time. But when they finally come, they, of course, are obliged to negotiate the requirements with the developers. On the other hand, the Agile does not address, because it cannot, the issue of how product owners agree and negotiate with the end users. But that's another story. An old dream about analysis. Let us make it pragmatic and continuous. Do not cut big requirements, business requirements, into small implementable pieces upfront, but during the whole process, and this is the whole process is. We, in Agile projects, we have got methods to cut requirements realistically into small pieces called very often user stories that should be something that customers want, sometimes called minimal marketable feature, whatever. But Agile does not solve it how it works in between sprints, but that's another story again. Modeling. We have for a long time been looking in vain for some sensible middle way between extremely sloppy and risky natural language and between refined but extremely expensive modeling. And this is what, in a sense, it can be discussed if there are not better ways. But user stories is a sensible compromise between costly real modeling, mathematical modeling, and sloppy poetry called traditional user requirement specifications. Specifications. We have got, before noon, during presentations, we have seen wonderful examples, too much documentation, and on the other hand, we probably know from experience projects with dramatically too little specifications. And now we've got a middle way, which Agile somehow forces people. You cannot start an Agile project if you haven't got this specification at all. And it is flexible, and so on and so on. Let's go on. Traceability. Old dream. We wanted to see the connections between requirements and code, and between requirements and, of course, test cases. And we use very big and powerful tools to beat the inherent complexity of traceability between 10,000 requirements and 50,000 test cases and 5 million lines of code. Agile kind of tries to avoid the problem by trying to achieve less complexity, sometimes in ways which can be argued are not really fully legal. But if there is less complexity, there is less need for traceability. No need for traceability because it advocates much communication. And when there is much communication, it is more difficult to get lost and need a powerful tool to get you out of this. One point of control, small sprint backlogs, less need for traceability, but this is no guarantee, and somebody has already mentioned it. You ask a question about how do you manage traceability, and Agile is not the solution, but it potentially makes the problem smaller, potentially. Priorities. An old dream is to have priorities, because otherwise the customers say everything is most important, and Agile has managed to, well, they make the decision during sprint planning. You want this user story, okay, then you won't get another because it's too many story points. So other attributes. An old dream is that we need a lot of attributes for requirements. And it was so hard to know who was the owner, who was the author, what was the rationale. And in a way, we wanted to know the status. DOD, definition of done, is a very good practical definition following, tracking the status, other quality attributes. We've got many principles in Agile that tell us, in essence, they can be mapped into quality requirement attributes. And of course, we wanted them testable. And Agile is our tester's dream because it says a requirement, part of the requirements are the scenarios or acceptance criteria. Yes, we've got it. For the first time in many, many years, we've got requirements defined by the tests, or half at least. And this is an example of how, with our charts, Gantt charts, and task dashboards, sprint make requirement status visible. I'm not going into. And of course, we testers asked for having this direct connection between requirements and test cases, and we've got it in a way through Agile. Acceptance criteria. Of course, it is not complete because acceptance criteria is a minimum set of test cases, but better than nothing, of course. We wanted testers to be able to ask people for clarification if they didn't understand the requirements. Now they are welcome to. During sprint planning meeting, testers, anybody must ask for clarification. We wanted people to understand that tests essentially can be used as requirements, and by methodologies like test-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, we make a big step in this direction. And we wanted this on all test levels. And of course, Agile has problems with test levels. Acceptance testing outside sprints is widely discussed how it should be done, even in Agile projects. I know, I'm running out of time. So another dream, impossible dream. Because usually there are two activities. We had a big table, a database, a register with requirements. And on the other hand, someone was running the test time plan, and test and project time plan with tasks, who was doing what. But it was difficult to achieve direct mapping of project tasks to requirements. Agile does just, it was a very old dream. Yes, you can follow very old names here. And sprint is essentially a task-driven, sprint tasks, which are project tasks, there is a perfect mapping between tasks and requirements, which are user stories. This is otherwise very difficult to achieve in traditional methods. But this is more difficult for stuff concerning non-functional requirements, which cannot really be expressed well as user stories. And of course, it is more difficult for kind of tech stories or technical requirements, which we should have and try to fulfill them if we do not want to listen to scary stories of a growing technical debt that will one day kill us all. Validation, an old dream, is to be able to validate the requirements themselves before we build any code of them. And we've got it. Yes, a lot of requirement validation, imperfect, not very formal, but it's done in Agile projects before the requirements are implemented. And we wanted early validation through looking at the product, but early, not 6 months later. And we got it. After every sprint, there is a sprint demo or sprint review where we validate the requirements. If we build a totally wrong thing, we are 4 weeks late or 5 weeks late or whatever the sprint was, but not 10 years late or not 6 months late. Management, we wanted to manage requirement changes somehow. And we know how it could become with scope creep and unplanned change requests or refused change requests for no reason. And of course, Agile provides or attempts to provide, as the best attempt I have seen, it's a kind of requirements management machine based on sprints. Summing up, Agile, in my opinion, is not any huge new paradigm because it's in essence, even using very different terminology, just is a big inverted commas here because it's a huge thing they have achieved, just allows us to implement what we've been talking about in software engineering for many years. But this is extremely successful, the first really successful, not perfect, not the best, but very successful, pragmatic way of really achieving what we have before Agile been talking should be done, but nobody would listen. So you can find this presentation there. And as a person nowadays, we are often in this unwelcome situation. Some people believe Agile replaces all traditional software engineering, including requirements engineering, which, according to what Rainer told us this morning, is not true. Agile can be made much, much richer by learning that traditional software engineering, requirements engineering is not something to be scored at, but something to be adapted. On the other hand, there are a lot of people saying Agile is just a passing fad, something that just is fashionable for a while. It is not. It is actually the first successful attempt to implement good practices in practice so that it works. So I believe we have to, and this is I believe Rainer Grau stole my ending because he said, let Agile adapt the best practices of the so-called traditional software engineering, requirements engineering, and let us traditional requirement engineers learn from Agile practices which are so extremely successful. Thank you very much.